Hey guys, a quick message from our sponsors. Yep, we're trying that again on the Amp Hour. We decided to try it in this case because we think it's a good deal for listeners of the show. We talk about distributors and ordering parts pretty often, and it just seemed like a good fit. Aero.com, who has the cheapest and fastest shipping in the industry, wants you to try out their new website and hear what you think. How bad do they want to hear about it? Well, they're giving new customers 30% off almost anything they order. That's the best deal we've seen, especially if you have a big project coming up. I'm heading to DEF CON and, well, there's a lot of last-minute orders going on. I also found out they upgrade shipping on orders, so even if you're not a new customer and don't get that 30% off, you'll still get the upgraded shipping. If you're like me, those last-minute design changes really benefit from the overnight shipping that's free, and it'll save your project from delays and make it look like you ordered the right parts the first time around. So try out Aero.com, built by engineers for engineers like you, and save 30% on the parts that you need for your next project. This is the Amp Hour Podcast. Released August 6th, 2018. Episode 402. An interview with Ben Einstein. Welcome to the Amp Hour. I'm Chris Gamble of Contextual Electronics.
And I'm Ben Einstein of Bolt.
Welcome, Ben. How you doing?
I am doing great. How are you, Chris?
Good. Very good. So if people don't know, Ben is the founder of Bolt.
It is true. It is true, the founder.
So what is Bolt in a couple of sentences? What is your... Oh, boy. Here we go. I'm going to try and cut back on my BS stuff here, but what's your elevator pitch for Bolt, Ben?
Oh, no. Please help me. So Bolt is an early-stage, hardware-focused venture investor, and we spend an outsourced amount of our energy supporting founders with pretty deep technical experience. So unlike probably the vast majority of venture firms out there, we have a pretty big engineering team and two large prototyping facilities, one in San Francisco and one in Boston, and really roll up our sleeves with the founders of companies. We invest at the earliest possible stage. So I think the current term for that is pre-seed, but in some number of months or years, we'll probably have a new term, and we'll be doing that. And so it's really the first time founders pick their heads up to really build a product and a company around that product is sort of where we're ready to start working with companies.
Nice. Well, I think that astute Amp Hour listeners of a long time will remember that we actually did a meetup at the Bolt Boston headquarters back in 2013, I think.
Many years ago. I think when we were first getting off the ground.
Yeah, I think so. And it was right around, I believe it was around the Open Hardware Summit that we were in. I was in town for that. And I was like, that was a great meetup. And that's a great space too. It was like right downtown, I believe. Yeah,
we had to get super creative with that space. I think no one had built a machine shop in downtown Boston in like 50 or 60 years. Yeah, right. So we had all kinds of ridiculous problems with getting approval from governments and closing streets down and lifting machines through windows. It was pretty entertaining. Right. And when we got started, we had this tiny little fund, $3.5 million. And so we had to get extremely creative about how we do many of those things, which also is partly what makes the space interesting is when you have these tight constraints around, sort of how much money you can spend or how much time you have available to do something. And so there's some pretty unique, slightly weird features about that office, which I think in most ways I'm proud of and is also pretty bizarre when people see it now.
Right. Yeah. So why was it in Boston in the first place? What drove that decision?
It's I think it was mostly around the sort of hardware ecosystem in Boston. And again, this is going back to like 2011, 2012, when I was starting to think about Bolt from my product design experience. And I spent as a sort of the customer development journey that I think many great hardware founders do, actually probably founders of pretty much all types of companies, where they kind of canvas a market or an opportunity and talk to some investors and some founders and some, sort of adjacent folks and other businesses that maybe aren't in the venture world, and try to sort of understand where needs lie. And so this was not I think, hardware companies need a venture firm. It was much more, I saw all these founders that were starting to sort of twiddle with atoms instead of bits that didn't have the support they needed. They didn't have the infrastructure around them. And so I saw this opportunity from a sort of a market need standpoint of folks that were trying to build businesses around physical products and just didn't have the support structure around them. And so like any naive founder, it was sort of like, I can do all those things. It turns out many of those things are really hard and different from what I expected, which I'm sure we can talk more about if you're curious.
That's definitely on the docket here. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
And so what about your background? So you were from the Boston area as well, or no?
I grew up in New Jersey, and I went to school in Massachusetts, and kind of got hooked into the Boston scene pretty early on. And I right out of school, sort of this kind of long funny story. I sort of accidentally inherited a product design and development company, which was really my first business.
Oh my!
Yeah, it was a wonderful friends of mine, if they're out there, Jamie and Matt Page, who were running a sort of medium-sized product design consultancy in sort of central Western Massachusetts, and we're just wonderful humans working on some amazing stuff. And I would do internships with them, and I was sort of very, very close to them when they were kind of getting their business off the ground. And then the sort of 2007, 2008 stuff started to happen. And one of the first things that big companies do, which was most of their clients, is they cut their research and development budgets. And that means all the small service businesses that are supporting them typically have major project cancellations, which is not good for relatively small companies of, 20, 30 people. So they very quickly went from, a nice functioning business to less so. And I was there sort of standing, holding the pieces somehow, which is a whole, probably a conversation better over drinks.
Sure. Yeah.
And, but it was great because right out of the gate, I, had a handful of people and some clients that were kind of knew me and knew the business and kind of trusted us. And that allowed a little tiny consultancy to get started and kind of grow naturally, but with very few months in the red, which is very unusual for most service businesses getting off the ground, especially from guys like me who have no idea how to run a company at the time.
And like, so, how big were those scraps? I mean, like you said that it was kind of fell apart and then you inherited the pieces, but like was it multiple employees or like what?
Yeah, it was multiple employees and an office space and a handful of clients. And so it's a little sort of a skeleton of a company. Yeah. And I think they had gone from, I don't know what the number was, 35, 36 people to like 4 or 5 relatively quickly, and maybe a couple of months. It was a hard time, and
just fill in the rest with hustle, right? That's the.
I mean, totally. I think there's something to be said for that, and I'm a big believer in like diving in and learning from experience rather than from classrooms or reading or passively talking to people. It's a much more active process for me. And so I just kind of didn't really know what I was doing and kind of asked for advice when I needed it and made some mistakes and did my best to fix them. And it's amazing how much you learn that way if you're diligent and I think proactive and thoughtful and try to be fair and respectful to people. It doesn't always work out, but I think we had a bunch of clients that were super supportive of that. And I think wound up to become big pieces of our business, for the first couple of years there when I was getting that company off the ground. But I pretty quickly started to get frustrated with the service business model and the sort of selling your time, as some folks will probably realize. And this really started to happen when we started doing a couple of sort of like licensing type deals. I don't know if you've ever been involved in any of these sort of like unusual types of business models where you're like trying to figure out something more interesting.
Getting past those hours, you mean? Like, so
it's
like you just sell a reduced rate for your hourly, but then you say, but like 10 points on the back end.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And I had I'm not like a business person that was like, I have a strategy here to like take this much equity.
I was copying that from Maury Ballstein saying that at the end of Zoolander. So like, that's about my level of,
I think it's very similar. I think I'm one notch above Maury Ballstein, but closer than you might realize. And so it was sort of back of the envelope, whatever we could get working. And
it's like taking a gamble on maybe making more money later, but
totally
doesn't always work out.
But I started to notice this really interesting thing, which was we had all these folks that were working on these projects that got super excited about working on these little tiny rinky-dink products. And it was because they were, 2 people and a dog trying to invent some new product versus, a large company with, 20 people that have to approve things and, SOPs and scope changes when we had to design something differently and all that crap. And people got really excited by like this very early, loosey-goosey kind of free-form product development that I think we'd done a little bit of, but it wasn't our business.
So like startup within a startup almost?
Yeah, totally. And it was kind of, experimental when you're like at a decent size and you have enough money to throw around to sort of maybe lose a little bit of money on some experimental stuff. And I just saw the difference in sort of morale between people that were working on those projects and people that were working on the, the Fords and the Motorola's and the, the big companies.
Right.
And so a sort of light bulb went off and I tried to like spend more time thinking about that. We eventually, we did a bunch of weird stuff, licensed a couple of things. We did a couple of equity sort of, I don't know if I'd call it investments, but they were sort of kind of what you were talking about, equity on the back end. They would pay a little bit up front.
Yep.
And, pretty much all those went to zero. We had one product that was very successful, and we had, I don't remember what it was, a couple of bucks per unit, $5 a unit or something. And they sold, again, I don't remember the numbers, hundreds of thousands of these things.
Oh, wow.
And it was actually the first iPhone Bluetooth accessory that was ever approved by Apple, which Sounds more fun than it was.
Well, I just mean that that's a heck of a title, though, right?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, there were a bunch of small companies trying aggressively, as soon as Apple announced the accessory functionality with Bluetooth, there were a bunch of small companies all sort of racing to start, and Apple had all kinds of problems with their Bluetooth stack, so it was incredibly difficult product to build, actually. But it's this magical thing happens when you're sitting there, and every month you get a check in the mail, and you didn't do a whole lot of work.
Right.
And that was sort of the key light bulb moment of okay, that we had shared alignment with this company, and that was the sort of the key moment of the sort of beginning of the Bolt journey of trying to find a better way to work with companies that wasn't just selling our time in sort of a linear fashion. And then once it's done, you're sort of done, and whatever the company makes from it, they sort of keep for themselves. And that was a really nice feeling. And so that's a big part of the sort of driving factor of getting Bolt off the ground.
It sounds like the hard part in that scenario, I mean, either way, you have to do the engineering work, right? And not that that's not the hard part, but the hard part is, it seems like to get that check at the check coming every month, where it feels like you're not doing anything. It feels like that was actually an investment of not picking the Palm accessory, right?
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
In a world where there's infinite, possible, timelines, right? You picked the one that was the iPhone timeline, and that was the right one. So
yeah,
you didn't spend that time elsewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. And like many things in life, it is about luck, probably more than anything else. And we just happened to, do a couple of things right. And again, it wasn't millions and millions of dollars and everybody's going to retire. It was okay, there's something here. It was it was a sort of a sign more than anything else that there was an interesting business model around helping young hardware companies get off the ground. And, it's a much longer story, but that sort of evolved into, I guess, what many people call a venture firm, which is, money is a big part of that process, but we spend a lot of time in sort of where our roots were around the engineering and sort of supporting these companies very closely.
Yeah. So, I mean, how did that transition start then? Were you oh, well, I needed to figure out how to make this bigger, or what was that piece?
So that's how it started. It was, okay, this is interesting. How do I do this more?
There's something here.
Exactly. It was a little cookie crumb that was okay, there's something I should keep following. And I think many founders can, hopefully empathize with this feeling. It's this sort of one conversation leading to another for hundreds and hundreds of people. And that was over a year and a half or so of spending a lot of time talking to, people maybe slightly more entrepreneurial or slightly more business oriented than I was. I'm really a sort of product guy. I think I understand business better now, but at the time I sort of didn't really have any strategy.
I guess we should charge money for this stuff.
Exactly.
You guys are good, right?
Exactly. Well, I mean, it sounds silly, but I just loved building products so much, and so it was almost I didn't care. And that's a very dangerous thing to ever tell a client or anything.
Wait, how are we paying for these molds, guys?
Exactly. Oh shit. Money is a valuable thing to do things well. And so at first I was talking to all kinds of very all over the map people, regional development folks, and I remember speaking to the founder of Yankee Candle, all just kinds of weird stuff, just trying to get my head around how would companies sort of approach building products if they had a different way of thinking about it. And the gateway moment was I was spending some time in Boston, and I met these two guys who are very well-known angel investors in Boston, Warren Katz and Will Herman, who are still close friends of mine today. And they were the first people to really tell me okay, this is pretty weird, but there's something interesting here. And they introduced me to a very well-known guy named Brad Feld. And who is a venture capitalist at a pretty well-known venture firm called Foundry Group, and probably one of the most supportive, honest VCs I've ever met.
And a great writer too.
A great writer,
yeah.
great thinker. He's like super open. And he had he was a dorky MIT guy who was sort of early in the computer world. And he moved out to Boulder, Colorado and, started this venture firm, which has all kinds of interesting stories that went into that. And he was one of the very first people to sort of institutionalize the sort of hardware software investing thing. And so they had this category that they invested in called human computer interaction. And that led them to invest in companies like MakerBot and Fitbit and Sphero and a whole bunch of other interesting companies, which I had the very unique pleasure of talking to him about in Boulder when he was, he spent a significant amount of time with me early on. And became convinced that like all these portfolio companies that they had poured millions of dollars into could hugely benefit from sort of what I was talking about with sort of the skeleton for Bolt.
Well, he's probably, every time that they freak out, they probably, maybe not go to him, but he probably hears about it at least. Of like,
and he didn't know, right? I think he knew computers and software and had been around the block with the venture world, but he's not a hardware guy. He didn't know how to mold things or how to go to China or how to deal with retail or, you kind of, as many venture firms do or partners do, you kind of figure these things out as you go with each company you invest in. But I think he clearly recognized, like, okay, this is the thing that you've done a bunch of. I have all these companies in my portfolio that could probably use something like this or could have used something like this earlier on.
Yeah, right.
And institutionalizing this in some way seems like a really good idea. So he agreed to invest personally into that first Bolt fund and then introduced me to all these people, the James Park and the Fitbit guys and Bree Pettis and MakerBot team when they were, 10 people or something. And all these companies that were kind of just getting off the ground trying to figure out how to build product at scale. That was, at least a big part of it was physical and they were really struggling. And that was the big transition moment from, okay, this is I'm going to add on to my existing business and kind of do slightly more, licensing equity type weirdo deals to, okay, this is actually a different company, which thinks about and is structured differently than I was thinking. And that really was the key defining moment in like the sort of venture fund part of the way Bolt operates, which is a really important change in how we work and how we think.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd like to just call back to that thing real quick where you were talking about, the introductions. I mean, I never really gave it as much credit as I should have back in the day. I've obviously been learning, small bits and pieces here and there. I'm not deep into this world, but like that, the fact that you like, and then this person introduced us to this and this and this and this and this. Yeah. Like, I used to get like really upset actually about like the whole idea of like, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But I think that was kind of a very naive view of it because it's more about there's so much stuff that you, again, like the infinite possibilities kind of thing. A startup could go and call every vendor on a list to try and do something, but it's usually much more efficient to go and call a trusted source or, go to an investor for references. And so like, how has that people side of things impacted Bolt and your journey?
Oh, it's the single biggest leverage, sort of like point of leverage or piece of leverage that I've figured out. It's sort of a cheat to building a great company. Yeah, it really is. It's, and I think people that, I'm a pretty big introvert. And so I am not like the first person to like go speak to a bunch of people or like, I'm happy talking about things that I know well, but as soon as it's like go social network about blockchain, I'm sort of like, it's the last thing I want to do. Right. And so I've figured out that there's and this is actually a big part of Brad and some other folks around him that have sort of helped him do this because he's the same way in sort of thinking about people slightly differently, not as this sort of scary thing that you have to go out and like talk to them, but as people you can learn from and people that can learn from you and forming these like very genuine relationships based on trust and comfort and sort of, it's a type of intimacy. Yeah. And so it's actually it's a framework that comes very squarely out of an old, somewhat silly book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Yeah. Which exactly, which really isn't. It's actually incredibly simple. It's like be good to people, and good things will come.
And also use their name, Ben.
Thank you, Chris.
I always remember that one. That one always seemed like really trite, but it's like a lot of these things are kind of like common sense trite things, and it's like it's only if you use them in a shitty way, right? If you're
Totally.
like shaking someone's hand and repeating their name over and over again,
Totally.
you're like, okay, that's just as bad as any cocktail party, like you were talking about dreading,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. I mean, the key for me is, and the key like word about all this stuff is around intent.
Yeah.
Right. And so like you can say the same thing over and over again and like shake the hands and do the things. But if your intention isn't genuine and real in terms of the way you think about it, people are going to figure it out.
Yep.
And so my intention with whatever meeting Brad and meeting others isn't, oh, look at this fancy person who has a bunch of money and can like help me do a bunch of things.
Right.
It's, man, I really like this guy and he's being really supportive and like I want to help him however he can and he's helping me however he can.
Yep.
And that, I think that mechanic is like a fundamental enabler of, I mean, I would say startups, but I would actually argue it's like, all of humanity.
Humans.
It's like, yeah, but it's so true. And it's really like this fundamental thing that I think people that are good at that have this charisma and like way of being genuine and genuinely supportive to each other and to others are so much more likely to succeed in whatever way they define success. And so I've worked really hard to like curate that and be not fearful of the sort of like difficult conversations that sometimes come from networking or from a hard negotiation or whatever, and just trying to be as real and genuine as possible. And it's amazing what a difference it makes. And I think Brad was a big part of telling me that and sort of teaching me that. I think I actually listened to the Dale Carnegie book on audio tape, whatever it's called. Audible. I don't know what the correct noun for Audible is.
I believe that's an LP of
yes.
recorded word. Yes.
The spoken word. Yes. And it's amazing what a difference that framework makes. Yeah. And so if there's like, people out there that are nervous about talking to humans, just know that lots of other people feel the same way, and sort of centering yourself around being genuine and, focusing on the things that you feel most comfortable talking about. I'm really comfortable talking about tearing apart hardware products and injection molding. And so I focus on those things and lots of stuff grows out of that versus trying to like force myself to whatever, like talk about business models eloquently, which sometimes I do and sometimes I don't because it depends on what I know.
Well, around here, we always encourage people to always bring something they've worked on to a meetup because people are always interested in it and it's easy to talk about. And the meetups that we do, we always try and get everyone to bring something because then it's just like, it's not, hey, who are you and how can I meet you and what can you do for me? Because that's always a shitty thing to do. It's more like, hey, what do you got there? Like, tell me about that. Because like that looks cool, right? Like, and that's really like, that's kind of how the hardware folks, I think, perform best is like when there's hardware in hand. So
look at this thing I did.
Exactly.
And I also think it's a big confidence booster for people. At least I feel that way. Like if I'm like talking about something that I've done or I showcase a product I've worked on or something, I feel like it's like a really good icebreaker because I feel super comfortable like talking about it and sort of proud. And so long as you're still like engaging with other people and not just like, spewing a bunch of stuff about how good your thing is. It's a total pro tip to how to sort of, I don't know, networking is kind of this weird term, but how to network. And so I think little cheats like that are very powerful in getting folks like me and maybe a little bit like you and some other folks that are a little bit more shy to like break out of your shell a little bit and start talking. And I always find once you get going about some interesting topic that someone gravitates to, it's actually really easy. It's like it's like the first couple of sentences that are always challenging.
Yeah. Cool. That's great. So what was the next step then? So you actually had to go like, so your worst nightmare, you had to then go and talk to a bunch of VCs to raise that first fund that actually allowed you to build that first place?
Yeah, it was less VCs. There were a few investors I was talking to that cared. Most VCs thought hardware was stupid, and this is 2011, 2012.
That's direct.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think most people think SaaS and social media were sort of like the big thing at the time. It probably still are in many ways, and they were kind of they gave less sort of credence to the value of building things physical, and so they were pretty dismissive, as VCs often are. And I sort of quickly figured out that raising money from VCs actually wasn't right for me for this first fund. And just also the way funds work is actually because of management fees and some other sort of more nuanced topics about how venture funds operate. You actually, in many cases, don't want to raise money from funds. You do want to raise money from individuals, and sometimes those individuals are partners at funds. So Brad, as an example, wrote a check from his personal net worth, not from Foundry Group.
Got it. Right.
And so,
that's
which
actually
was really
something
valuable.
I always forgot about. Well, not forgot about. I learned very much later on. I always thought that VCs like had a lot of personal money. I did not realize that it's usually them shepherding other people's money. I mean, sometimes they are also invested, but like that was just a, TIL for me, like
Totally.
yeah.
The way that's the way venture got started was I'm going to take a bunch of my money and I know how to do things because I'm rich, and let me invest this money into other people. So if you look at the very early days of like what people would call venture capital, early Silicon Valley in the 50s and 60s, that's really what it was. And there was no management fee. You weren't paid to do that because it was your own money, so you didn't care to pay yourself
as much as you can, right? Yeah, right.
Totally. Whereas now, that's the vast minority.
Right.
Is that set up, and the vast majority are, companies like us, where I am definitely the poor guy of the three partners at Bolt, because I haven't made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars myself. But the fund is still created in the same structure, even if you do have a lot of personal net worth, where you might write 1% or 2% or maybe 5% of the fund as a check, as sort of a personal investment. But the structure is in place to equalize all of what are called the limited partners. So Bolt, as an example, we have a bunch of other entities that are investing tens of millions of dollars into our fund, and then most of the upside of that fund is actually returned to those individuals or those foundations.
Got it.
And that's how 99% of venture firms actually work, is really architected around these other folks. So it's super fascinating. And the venture world has all kinds of problems, but it's a very interesting sort of type of business model, which I didn't know anything about. But I've since learned, maybe not everything, but I've learned a good amount.
So at the end of the day, it's a bucket of money. A bunch of people throw money in, and then people like you help decide where to put it towards.
Yeah, so one of the most beautiful, elegant parts of the venture business is the GPs. So guys like me or other, maybe slightly more fancy people at other bigger venture firms.
General partner. Is that right?
General partner, yeah.
Yep.
They sort of have a sort of a partnership relationship with the LP or the limited partner. And the way we always think about it is the limited partner puts in all the money and has very little control. And the general partner puts in very little money and has, very much control. And so it's really a trust relationship between the LPs and the GPs. And the trade-off for that is the LPs get most of the financial upside. So in most venture firms, which is, that's what they're interested in.
Money makes money.
Exactly. And in most venture firms, it's typically, what's called the carried interest is typically about 20%. So of every dollar returned over the fund size, the GPs will get 20 cents on the dollar. And the LPs get 80 cents on the dollar. That's a pretty good deal. And so that's really the fundamental mechanic of what enables the venture business and, to be honest, many startup sort of businesses or sectors to actually function. And so I find it actually super interesting. It's definitely like I've had to find my own way of doing it because I could not survive as a partner at a traditional venture firm.
Right.
That is just not my DNA. And so we have a very unusual way of operating. And that is the only reason I'm here, because I couldn't do the normal thing.
I'm curious about that too. So like, why didn't this exist prior to this? Why, or maybe it did. I mean, like, it seems like, and we're going to talk about the mechanics of, how you help start up, specifically hardware startups. But,
totally.
But why wasn't there this kind of model prior to this?
That is a good question. I think there are always interesting permutations on this model.
Okay.
When I say this model, I mean sort of the venture model. So there's companies like Idea Lab. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Bill,
a few,
right?
Pasadena. And a handful of other folks that have sort of done unusual things around venture, where they sort of incubate companies or start companies or sort of invest in people before they even have a company and that kind of thing. So I think there's a handful of folks like that. There was never really that for hardware companies, and I think I don't know exactly why. I'm not a great student of history with the venture world, but I'm pretty sure the primary reason for that is hardware is not by itself is not an attractive business. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But selling a widget for, 20, 30 points of gross margin dollars is really challenging as a business in today's day and age. There are a few companies that can do it. It is really, really hard. Yeah. And so VCs and frankly, entrepreneurs are fairly cautious around building. Building a company is really hard. Building a hard type of company is exponentially more challenging, and so being careful about business models is something that good business folks are really savvy to, and so I think there has been a relative underfunding and relative under sort of performance of those sort of traditional hardware businesses for that reason, and that's changing. And that's changing not because people buy things differently or any fundamental restructuring of venture or anything like that. It's changing because the definition of hardware has changed, and the idea that you have just a widget that sits there in your house, collecting dust, is more or less gone, at least in the category of sort of startups, and it's now really focused on the sort of combination of software and hardware being a really good mechanism of getting software into a user's life in a way that's not on a screen. Yeah. And it turns out there are a whole bunch of interesting things you can do when you take software off the screen. And we're at the very beginning of that journey now. And so I think more than anything, that was a luck move for me. Getting Bolt off the ground was I sort of saw this problem, and at the same time there was this other thing happening, which was software was sort of breaking out of the two-dimensional plane of a screen and sort of embedding itself in all kinds of other things. And now that has become, I think, one of the major dominant technology trends that will last for decades. This is not a fad for a couple of years while VCs get excited about it, then it goes away. This is a fundamental restructuring in the way companies big and small and consumers think about technology.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's not like the stuff on the screen will go away as well. It's also,
of course,
it's a yes and right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's it's really an augmentation,
right?
And it's actually, I struggle with predicting where that will go because it's so many huge possibilities of the way we think about technology creeping into things other than software. And so that's one of the fun things about being in the venture world is, you don't have to decide. You get to, find the people that decide.
Right.
And that's a very empowering part of this business is I am not the person to sit in a room and think of the next great widget or the next great business model or the next great concept. I'm into the process of building those things. Yeah. And it's a very, very different thing. So it is definitely completely changed the game for hardware companies. The fact that software is all over the place, and it's really, at the end of the day, it's enabled in a couple of different ways by mobile phones, and I think that is the key enabler of all of the things that you and I probably both collectively work on. Is around the supply chain and the way consumers think, and apps and all these other things are the sort of infrastructure that make the ecosystem survive.
So we started kind of with the origin story of Bolt, but now let's talk about like the origin story of a company that would maybe be going through with Bolt, right? So you kind of mentioned that you're going to be talking to people who are making that future, and you're going to, so where do they start? Like, how do they find you? And maybe specifically, how would someone listening to this find you, pitch a thing to you, and then like, what are the services that Bolt ends up, walking them through eventually?
Man, I could talk your ear off about all those things. So I will do my best.
Not just my ear, by the way. It's many ears. Cool. So hopefully some with interesting ideas.
Cool.
Too.
Yeah, we try to be super open. It's gotten a little bit harder as the number of companies that we are working on and pitch us have dramatically increased over the last couple of years. But we really encourage pretty much anybody to reach out to us if you're thinking about a business that involves we call it the sort of intersection of hardware and software. We are happy to talk. So probably the easiest way to do that is just going to our website, which is bolt.io. I'm also pretty public in places, and so you can reach out to me directly. People can find my email address easily. If you can't, it's ben@bolt.io.
We told the secret.
I mean, my mission here is really to support hardware companies. So if someone has a question or an idea or something that they're really focused on, I'm super happy to help in whatever way that I can. We spend a good amount of time meeting companies for the first time and trying to understand how are these people thinking about building a business, and is this a business that we believe has what the industry will call venture returns, which are big businesses doing typically in some number of years, 5 to 7 years, doing $100 million of revenue or more. These are large
Okay.
companies.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of lens that we have to look through. It's not because those are the only kinds of products that I think are interesting. It's because that's the business that we have.
And like the timeline of the actual fund itself as well, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think everybody is sort of victim to their own business model in whatever way that is. And ours is in order for our business to work, we have to find really big outlying companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so we work really hard to do that. And that's typically the number one reason why we actually won't work with a company is hey, we think this is great. We think you're great. We like your product. But this just isn't we don't yet believe this is the type of business that will generate that type of revenue in the time frame that we expect. And so those are always the hardest decisions because there's so many interesting people out there and products that, at least very selfishly, I want to work on. But it really has to align with our business. And so we will spend, a handful of meetings with a company trying to get to know them and looking at the product. Most companies will have some sort of prototype or some sort of, pretty good explanation of what they want to build. We will then make an investment in those companies if our partnership decides that that's something that we want to do. And that investment ranges probably on the low end, we'll write a, $100,000 or $150,000 check. And we will write larger checks, $500,000, $750,000, depending on, again, the progress of the company and how much we believe the founders and all kinds of other things.
I was actually really surprised. I think it was the first time I was out of the Pure 9 space that you guys had/have. And I was hanging out with Chris and Kate, and they were telling me just how many people apply weekly. And you had mentioned
a lot.
You had mentioned the numbers had gone up, and this was a couple years ago when I had talked to them about it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's. I mean, in some ways, we always want more, right?
Sure,
so this is always a good thing.
Right, it's a filtering
but it is
system.
Competitive.
Yeah,
exactly. There are, I think for every company we invest in, there's about 120 that we look at.
Oh my goodness! Oh wow!
Yeah, so it's pretty nuts.
Let's step back to that a little bit more too. I mean,
sure.
Not that I think that it's not like, oh, if we just get this application right, they're gonna definitely cut you a check.
Of course,
but that's a lot of stuff to look at. I mean, and they also had some funny stories for things that they had looked at, and I don't remember them, nor would I probably be able to repeat them. But I remember there were some funny things as well. So maybe if you have any funny stories about that, in that 120, you're probably gonna get some nutty things. But
there are some wild things out there, and I think it comes from the fact that I think traditional software VCs probably see some pretty odd ideas too. I think hardware, the gamut of possibilities are so much wider, right? We just see some things that are, I remember like, I'm sorry if this person's listening. I don't remember who it was or anything, but I remember this person submitted a actually pretty well-designed slide deck. So it wasn't someone who's totally crazy. It was, there was lots of good images and renderings, and clearly a lot of thought went into it. It was like a spherical iPhone that you mount to the roof of your car to like analyze parking spaces in a city. I
mean, they're kind of doing that now, though. Like honestly. That's what's crazy. You guys missed out.
That guy. Yeah. Shit.
Yeah. They're doing that for autonomous mapping now. So like, sorry, man.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, we can't get them all right.
Yeah. And any big ones that you've missed? I mean, I guess that's always the fun thing with not fun for me, not fun for venture people.
Yeah. There are many. I mean, I think one of the things that's hard to call out is time is such a huge factor here, and we've only been around for 5 years. And so there are a bunch of companies that we, for one reason or another, decided not to work with that have become successful businesses. But in terms of like companies, with huge acquisitions or going public, there have been none of those yet.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So we never saw whatever Oculus or Nest or any of those companies because many of them were started prior to us getting off the ground.
I guess that's another thing that I think about that I guess I didn't really think about in the past, but I had since learned is like there's only so many people to pitch. I mean, there's a lot of money out there, but there's only so many people to pitch to, especially if you're in a specific area like hardware. And so you probably see, I mean, like the other hardware people do as well, but there's only, everybody sees everything and only some people pick it out. So you've probably seen the chance to see things that have worked out that you haven't invested in is probably pretty high,
That's the hope. And that's a big part of what we tell our LPs is that if you are focused to, I actually think hardware is not that specific, but if you're focused to what many people will call a specific vertical, I actually consider hardware more horizontal than vertical, but that's a religious debate.
Hardware for pets pets electronics, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But there are a bunch of companies that are doing pets hardware.
Yeah. I know.
And a handful of those businesses, we have a few of them, a handful of those businesses are actually doing really well. And, a bunch of them are not doing really well.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the nature of, especially consumer electronics, which is most of sort of the pet stuff. Consumer electronics are actually, I think the difference between a consumer business and a sort of B2B or an enterprise business are actually much greater than the difference of a software business and a hardware business, which is the thing that people, I think, really forget. And so the difference is critical to remember that I think there's much more that unites a hardware company trying to build a physical thing and manufacture it and deal with quality control and logistics and supply chain management and inventory and all these things that software companies don't think about. And that's really what ties many of these companies together is the hardware piece is just a tiny part of really the product, if you think about it that way, but it's a huge part of the business.
Sure. Yeah.
So mastering that, exactly. Yeah. Cash and supplier terms and all this stuff that most software companies don't have to think about. You have to master as especially a consumer hardware business. And those are hard. And there's not a lot of people around that have done that before to give you advice that makes any sense.
Right.
And so there are many AVCs that want to be the smartest person in the room because people ask them smart questions at board meetings, and they give an answer because they have some little piece of information about, oh, well, I know Apple uses Foxconn, so you should hire Foxconn.
Oh my gosh.
And it's that kind of thinking, and that's unfortunate. In most cases, that's a very bad decision for a small company to use a large, tier one CM.
Offshore immediately. That's
exactly,
the best idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we try really hard to sort of protect against that. But it's challenging because there's a lot of people out there that are, that are smarter than me, that have done a lot of interesting things in business that people really look up to, that just don't have that particular experience and don't have a good framework for why they're giving that answer to that question that someone asked them.
Yeah.
And those are hard conversations to have because, I'm just a guy that likes making stuff and designing things and manufacturing them. And people that have built, billion-dollar businesses before, giving them different advice it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, right.
So we spend a lot of time trying to sort of, I don't know if indoctrinate is the right word, but sort of help the companies kind of think the way we think around being careful and cautious.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Freudian slip.
Yeah, right. What we do is we have a boot camp of sorts, and then we have them repeat these phrases that we tell them.
Yeah, we don't want them to think on their own or make any decisions of any kind.
Right.
No.
Disrupt.
There are lots of tools and tricks that I think are an important part of sort of the Bolt package, if you kind of think about it that way.
Yeah.
We have a very specific framework that we use to think about product development. And, not in every case, but in 9 times out of 10, it tends to yield better results in the companies that we work with.
Okay.
And so that's just a big part of working together. So I think this whole answer sort of stemmed from you asking about sort of what that looks like from a process standpoint. So after we make an investment, sort of talked a little bit about check size there, we will spend, probably on average, it's about 18 months, maybe a little bit longer with companies. They don't have to move into one of our facilities, but that's totally an option if it helps the company get off the ground. So we have 2 big offices, one in Boston and one in San Francisco, and a small office in New York. And we try really hard to sort of work with the companies on literally a daily basis around product design and development and helping them, figure out some of the really hard decisions that you have to make in order to build a great product and a business around that product. And the center of that is really around the sort of engineering team that we have. And so covering mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, embedded systems development, industrial design, manufacturing and test, prototype builds. We spend a lot of energy and money and time with those companies to make sure they kind of go through those processes, maybe not perfectly, but more efficiently than they would go through them otherwise. And that's driven by lots of experience from a whole bunch of folks that are here at Bolt.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So
Sure.
First off, what is the motivation? So that is kind of feels like one of the core, aside from like obviously the investment, the introduction piece, like we talked about.
Totally.
The guidance and the education piece and the direct assistance seems like another big one. But what are the motivations that? Okay, so I'm a bit of a stubborn person. Why would I listen to your engineers versus other people? You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
Especially if there's conflict around an idea.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of interesting things with hardware and are a pretty accomplished person. So you might have different opinions than the average founder that is doing hardware for the first time, and pretty much all of our founders, that's the case. They might be very accomplished business operators and have started a company before, building software, some other business that's unrelated to hardware, and they're treading into a pretty different world for the first time.
Okay, so can you give us an idea of like percentage wise of the people that are first timers? Like, are these mostly software developers or business types, or like?
Yeah, I think it's about 80%.
Wow.
This is a number we have somewhere, but it's the vast majority of the companies that we invest in have never actually built hardware before as a business.
Holy moly.
And so there's a lot of it's not re-education and it's not indoctrination, but it's somewhere in between. Sort of
it's an introduction to the vagaries of the hardware world.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
deep
and it's kind of like
underbelly.
Don't scare people away, Chris.
Oh, sorry.
It's sort of like a recalibration is kind of the way we think about it. Uh-huh. You're sort of thinking about things a little bit differently. Sure. And so just being a little bit more cautious, and you have to plan a little bit more, and you have to be a little bit more careful with money. And so just being a little bit more thoughtful is a difference from the average software company, which can just like build a thing and ship it and see how it goes. And then if it doesn't work, change it and keep doing that ad infinitum. That's hard to do with hardware. And so we try to sort of re-architect the sort of the framework for how companies think about building at least the hardware part of their business.
So, but why do you, I mean, obviously this is coming from a hardware person, right? But like, why do you pick the ones who aren't already experienced with hardware in the first place?
Because it turns out that the best businesses are built not from great hardware product, but from great business product. So it's not just the physical thing in front of you, but the entire experience of the product. And that is how you first hear about the company, the website that they have, how they sell you and how they access you as a customer, so distribution channel, how you receive that product, how you take the product out and set it up, how the software process works, how the app works, or whatever the back end is sort of structured as, how customer support works and what the brand of the company is that they're experiencing, how you retire the product and get them to upgrade to the next one or continue to sell some consumable product or whatever else that sort of comes with that business experience. That is actually what makes a great product, not I can build a better circuit board than the next guy. That's I believe
just adding one more feature, Ben, will actually make my company successful. So I'd like to re-educate you right now.
No.
I know. Well, I'm sure you get that a lot though too, right? So you probably have to then
all the time
educate the 20% that are hardware people about like, hey, don't forget about website experience or whatever else is out there.
Totally. Yeah, there's definitely a correlation to the founders in our portfolio that have built hardware businesses. Again, this is a small N, but there are a few of them. And they spend probably more time than the average company does on product development. And they try to get everything just right. And so we have this really polar opposite approach. And this is against the sort of common wisdom that pretty much all venture investors have around hardware, and I don't understand because it's the opposite they have around software. We have this very strong belief, sort of a religious belief at this point, that companies should build not the perfect product. They should build something quickly that is good enough, that is not perfectly molded and doesn't have every feature, and the circuit board isn't amazing, and the battery life is not what they want, and the box sucks, and all the things that kind of go into building the product is good enough, not great. And it's one of the big disservices that companies like Apple and others do is they have so much money and so much control that they've primed founders to vector towards building these perfect products from day one. And it turns out that statistically is not an effective strategy to build a great company. You wind up spending too much money and you do these big launches. Kickstarter is probably one of the biggest sort of focal points of this, which luckily is going away. And you do these gigantic launches, and it's like this big, huge crescendo moment, and like either you succeed or you fail. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man.
And it turns out that is the worst way to run a company.
Yep.
The best way is to. Yeah.
Well, I've always just said the hardest thing is to get someone to give a crap about something on the internet, and this is now taking that thing and being like, but there's hardware too.
Exactly.
You could buy this thing for your house. Awesome.
Totally. Yeah. And it's really unfortunate that is still a pretty common belief in at least on the sort of investment side. So
is that because the investment side is used to the consumer experience of the opening up the new iPad or whatever it is? Is that where that's coming from, you think?
I think so. I think it's sort of tied into the experience of the world that many privileged oftentimes white men have of product, and it is this deep focus on quality and the experience of unboxing and the whole like YouTube unboxing thing and all that stuff. And it turns out that if you really look very carefully at customer behavior, that does matter. But it matters much, much later in the company's life. And the beginning of the company's life, when you're selling that first 10 or 100 or 1,000 products, again, depending on sort of your business, what matters way more is that you provide a good experience to the company. And so you know how to communicate with them, and you know how to empathize with them, and it's underweighting the first 5 minutes and overweighting the next year or 2 years or 5 years of experiencing that product. Whereas when you are a large consumer electronics company, people spend a huge amount of energy tearing down the like early experience of that product, because that's where many consumers, when you're selling millions of units, get caught up, is they can't figure out how to turn on a computer or how to boot up that iPhone or how to download the app or whatever, and they get stuck. And so it does actually matter, but it matters much less for the very early days of a company's life. And so I'm just a big believer in sort of the good enough product in the beginning. And again, this is strictly applies to like the first couple thousand units of a consumer product's sort of life. This is not about the entire life of the company sort of operating that way. I've just seen companies that really keep their heads down and focus towards making the customer happy over the long term way outperform the companies that focus on that perfect unboxing or that perfect molded product that no one even really notices in the beginning.
What about the split then too? Because this is another kind of underlying question I had was what are you targeting, consumer versus industrial versus anything else, versus I saw a medical company I think on here. So like how does that color the decisions of Bolt? I mean, obviously you do have some consumer level stuff, but I mean each situation is at least slightly different, if not more systemically different.
Yeah, I think there's a huge variance in our portfolio. I think that's one of the big misconceptions that people have about Bolt, and probably most investors in hardware, is everybody thinks and talks about the sort of consumer connected hardware companies, and that's actually a minority of our portfolio. Right. It's I don't know what the number is. It's probably 20 or 30%. There's a lot of variance in the types of stuff that we look at. So we kind of draw concentric rings around the sort of like connected hardware space, which is a big part of our thesis about the world, is that, again, it's kind of what we were talking about before, with software kind of being the center of many new hardware experiences, or at least a big part of it. That's sort of the focus. But we have lots of little sort of rings that sort of come outside of that sort of central area. So we've done a bunch of medical products, most of which are on the consumer side of medical, but they're still FDA regulated, and it's still an important part of their business. We've done a handful of space investments, which we're getting increasingly interested in, sort of space and aerospace. We have a good number of tools and services that support people making things. And so folks like, Tempo Automation, which is one of our very early portfolio companies from Fund One, helping probably many of your listeners build circuit boards, hopefully. Yeah. And we've done a few CAD investments like JoinCAD, and so we're thinking carefully about companies that are providing tools to folks that make things as well. And there's all these areas that we have sort of domain expertise in, because we've either bought those tools and services, or we've started companies in those areas, or we have portfolio companies that have worked with those types of companies. And so we have a sort of a insider advantage, if you kind of think about it that way, for seeing interesting companies in those spaces. And so we're pretty open. We have the majority of our portfolio are B2B and enterprise products that have some physical component, and a big piece of pretty much all of the businesses is what us in the venture world call recurring revenue, which is just getting a company or a user to pay more than once for a product. And there's actually a huge difference between what people call the razors and blades model, which I find sort of frustrating, and many of the sort of good recurring revenue business models that I think are what sort of power the great consumer businesses, and really enterprise businesses too, that are out there. And the razors and blades model is really, it's a sort of negative experience when you think about like buying a
right. You're
razor
gonna buy this
blade.
thing that's going to definitely break. So buy more.
Exactly. You are setting yourself up to create an unfortunate purchase decision. The transaction is full of negativity.
Right.
It's like when your air conditioner or your humidifier, you need a new filter, right? No one's like excited to go buy a new filter for your air conditioner. It's a thing you got to do every couple of years or whatever to keep the air clean. Right. And it's sort of this like womp womp kind of feeling. Yeah. And I try really hard to instill in many of the companies that we work with, and actually companies that we don't work with, that there's a huge psychological break between that and a company like Keurig, which, or, to use an old example, or Peloton, or someone else who is continuing to charge a significant amount of money, but it's for a product that you're excited to buy.
Yeah.
And so when you go out to the store and buy coffee, it's not like, oh man, I got to buy this thing to maintain my machine. It's, man, I'm really excited to like buy this kind of new flavor, or this, this different coffee company that I've never tried before, or this, this exercise workout that I have never tried and love going to.
Right. Well, it's almost like that product experience, but like on a micro level at that point, right? So it's like each time you look at that transaction, you're like, it's probably not conscious, but you are saying like, is this still worth it? And a lot of times, yes, it is, because of convenience or whatever it is. Like every time I look at Spotify on my credit card bill, right, I'm like, oh yeah, but I've listened to music on Spotify every day for the past month. So great, awesome, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't feel like it's maintenance. You feel like it's a product experience that you're paying for, and that psychological break is that I call that recurring revenue. I don't consider, even though technically a CFO would call this recurring revenue, I don't consider a filter replacement for a water filter or something recurring revenue in the same way.
It's not a why didn't this last longer?
Experience. Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's I had this experience originally, and now it's gotten worse, so I need to pay more money to make it back to normal. And that feeling versus the like, I have this thing and it works pretty well, but if I pay more, I get something else. That is totally different from a psychological standpoint. It sounds like a nuance, and it sounds like maybe like splitting hairs, but it's really a fundamental shift in consumer behavior. And so pretty much all of our companies have some recurring revenue, sort of more like the sort of positive experience rather than the negative experience, where the companies or the consumers are excited to pay that incremental charge for the coffee or the brick or the, whatever, the software or the data or whatever that kind of goes into that experience. Yeah. And so that is, again, one of the major trends sort of enables venture firms to find interesting trends in companies that are building physical products.
Well, let's talk about the flip side of that. I was going to bring it up, is the... when that kind of goes awry, right? Like the Juiceros of the world, and you did a very good analysis of it. And I think, so it's called, here's why the Juicero press is so expensive. I think this was a fantastic teardown, and you go through a lot of like,
thank you.
What is, what was going on in there. For a slightly more language-ridden, colorful version of it, you can always watch AVE's teardown of the Juicero. A little bit more Wi-Fi talk.
Yes, he likes his Wi-Fi.
He does like the Wi-Fi. But so that is kind of the flip side, and that's what I think some people think about of the, that recurring revenue model. So like, how does that square in there?
Totally. It's a great question. Juicero is an incredible study of excess, and it is not necessarily bad, but it is misaligned with the consumer, and that's why it didn't work.
That's a very you're going to run for office someday, Ben. I think. Yeah. Better get used to talking to people. Yeah.
No, I mean I know a lot of those guys, and I think pretty highly of especially the engineering team, which I've met on a couple of occasions, and I think one of the things that's important to remember about any company that goes belly up is in almost all cases, people, at least some people or most people at the company, have good intentions, and it just didn't work out.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
And so even though I think many people make fun of Juicero as sort of the poster child of how ridiculous companies can get in Silicon Valley, I think there was good intention there, and there were people that were trying to build something great. And in some cases, it is great.
Beautifully built too. I mean, exactly. Like that is the thing that you pointed out, and AVE pointed out, and like everyone pointed out, I was like, oh my god, like look at the machining on this stuff. However,
but yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think the way I always sort of describe it is I think many folks think of engineering as look at how amazing this is machined, or this cool process. This is a trap I fall into all the time. I'll be walking around a factory in China and be like, oh my god, this is incredible. But I sometimes have to remind myself to step back and think about the real definition of engineering is about finding the appropriate solution for a problem, not the coolest one to make.
Yeah,
and it's a trap.
This is a product thing too, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It's a vast majority of my training was sort of, I'm a mechanical engineer by background, but I spent a huge amount of time, even in undergrad, thinking very carefully about product. And so you sort of zoom out. It's kind of like one step up from engineering. And I'm very thankful for the professors and folks I've sort of talked to along the way that sort of instilled that culture of, it's not about how cool the thing is that you can build. It's about, is it solving the problem in an elegant way, whatever elegant means for your audience. It could be cost, it could be supply chain, it could be technical elegance, it could be, whatever, some incredible new alloy that can withstand some new performance metric or whatever. And I think understanding the sort of customer and sort of the audience of how the thing you're building fits into the full sort of business product, as I call it, I think is a really important component of building something great. And Juicero sort of missed that. They did a really good job building, really an unbelievable piece of technology in many ways, but it was something that didn't resonate with their consumers and was not the right sort of set of sort of features for what the sort of modern juice consumer, if that's a thing, sort of expects,
Right,
and the calculus is very simple. If you, I was one of the very first people to get a Juicero press. I buy a lot of the stuff, but, almost always to take it apart eventually, but I play with it for a little bit. And it is not a good it is not an economic calculation that makes sense.
Right.
You spend, at the time it was $700 for this machine, and then each juice was something like $6 or $6.50 or something like that. And you still have to do work to do it. So yeah, it's slightly cheaper than going to whatever, a juice bar and spending $9-10, which is still crazy to me that people do that every day. But it is not
San Francisco.
Yeah, you have to drink whatever hundreds and hundreds of juices a year for that to economically make sense, and the average person is not going to do that. So it just doesn't make sense. And I think if they had spent more time, to be totally honest, raised less money and spent more time engaging with customers and running, genuine sort of objective tests around what features matter and what costs make sense, they might still be alive today. They might be thriving. Juice is an incredibly interesting business in a whole bunch of ways. It's definitely a trend that, correlates, at least in some way, shape, or form, with health. Maybe not the like cold pressed, $10 juice thing, but, drinking more fruits and vegetables is definitely a good thing. And I think getting the barrier to eating and drinking more fruits and vegetables in the home lower is great. And I think many companies will do well by that at some point. Juicero, unfortunately, didn't have the right mix of constraints to build a great sort of business product. And that's eventually what led to their demise.
Well, and I think that, this kind of points back to all of the other stuff that you've written about too. I think that that's ultimately kind of like everything we're talking about here. It's like you've kind of started putting all, not just you as well, your whole team has been publishing on the Bolt blog. It's something I point people to regularly. Are there?
You're the one.
Oh, I'm the one guy. Yeah, I doubt I'm just the one person. I think TechCrunch might have a little bit more of a sway than Chris Gamble. For now, you better watch out, TechCrunch. Yeah, right.
Exactly. In our world, you are an influential fellow.
Right. Sure. But what are some things on there that think that do you have stuff that where you point beginners out? You get an email, you're like, oh hey, I wrote about this, like something you find that you're pointing people to on a regular basis. Yeah,
so that's where we have a handful of posts, which are really series of posts, and unfortunately they're extremely long. And if I was better at things like that you're great at, like podcasts, I would probably figure out a way to do that more eloquently.
Just have someone read your posts online. Yeah, we'll talk after this. Chris Gamble narrates the Bolt blog.
Oh, I see an interesting business model
yes, right.
up here. So there's one. I think the first one was on product sort of development, sort of the illustrated guide to like developing a product. And so we took one of our portfolio companies, a company called Dipjar, and sort of walked through the entire process from generating an idea up through manufacturing, sort of stable mass production, and talking about each stage and how those companies go through that process. And that's a common, hey, you have questions about product development, read this first and then let's talk.
Right, exactly. You have a common framework to talk about it, right? Before it's like asking the same questions everyone had, right?
Yeah, I think the problem with hardware is that there's, it's very variable. And so it's really hard to like read this and it'll answer all your questions. That doesn't really work. So it's much more like read this, we'll use the same terminology and be able to have an intelligent conversation about what you should do. And that tends to work pretty well. We have a similar post around team building. And so this is, again, probably the single most important thing you do as a founder of any type of company is the people you work with.
I know. And this is one that I always push back against too, but it's like, I used to push back against a lot more, but like, they always say like a founder's job is to source good people, but damn, it's right.
It's hard.
Right? I mean,
it's hard. And it's why you need, it's why you ironically need to hire people, because, at least myself, like I'm pretty good at hiring small numbers of people. I am not the hiring machine that great CEOs are, where they're constantly talking to people and getting them excited about their vision and kind of pulling them into their gravity. Yep. But actually a really important point that I always make about team building, and this is something that was made to me many years ago and has really rung true, is it's actually the team that you hire, the sort of like full-time sort of employees and partners are actually a relatively small part of a hardware company's team. And so we try really hard for people to remember that I'm kind of a space nerd. So I use the analogy of it's really like a solar system, and the team is definitely like this huge center point of how things are coming together. It's sort of like the sun of the solar system, the like full-time, dedicated team. But you have all these little planets around you that are without which you can't do your job. And so your lawyers are on your team and your CM is on your team and people you hire to do one-off work to help you with a firmware bug, they're on your team.
Yeah. Funding sources too, I'm sure, right?
Of course. And some of those folks are huge parts of a team and make gigantic differences. And so I think people sometimes overly index on, I got to be really good at like hiring people, and under index on the sort of solar system of people around you that might not work for you full time, might not be on your payroll, but understanding how to work with those folks and make them happy and select good folks is a really important skill. I bet you are, really good at finding a good contract manufacturer for boards that you've worked on. Better so than probably 99 out of 100 CEOs of even big electronics companies, and that is a really valuable sort of team building element of you as a person, even if whatever hiring people every day is not your sort of default mode of operation, and that's important.
Yeah, right. I mean, at the end of the day, you're right. There's not just hiring for individuals or that. Then I think that's the thing. Like we talked about earlier, it's like my mind always goes back to the type A,
totally
jock CEO type of, hey, how you doing? Like, good to meet you. Come on in.
Exactly.
Like that,
they're like,
not that it's even common or people that I've interacted with, right? It's just this stereotype that's in my mind, and that's what my mind goes to. But that's not necessarily who's the best at recruiting, anyways. So.
I mean, I think it's one of the big problems with the sort of archetype we have of Silicon Valley founders is this, you think of like whatever Travis of Uber or some of these other people that are just really
don't.
A lot of people do though. And I think when you talk to many VCs and stuff, they're looking for people that have that DNA.
Right.
And it's really unfortunate. It's a really shitty way of biasing yourselves away from good people. Yep. He is clearly a I don't know him, so maybe it's hard to judge, but like a bad person. And I think many people that have spent a lot of time with him would view
there's article on article of that, but
exactly. But and I know a couple of people that know him pretty well and are just like, he's not my favorite person to hang out with. I wouldn't trust him with my kids or whatever,
Okay.
Which is maybe not something that we should talk too publicly about, but something that I think is a really important part of building a great company is understanding that there are multiple dimensions to being good at team building, and you need all of them, not really good at one of them. And I think Travis is a specific example of someone I feel like I can talk about without being too offensive. I think is a high upper right quadrant, of one element of that, and really good with bringing in high powered people and getting people excited to work with him, but pretty bad at a whole bunch of other things that it takes to run a great company. And the sort of cultural elements are just as important, if not more important, than being able to attract great people.
Well, so like you mentioned, the team is bigger than just the founding company. So like, what are the sizes of people that usually come into Bolt, right? Or the teams that come into Bolt, and then like what are the people that are inside Bolt that can help out with
Sure. Yeah. So the team itself is it's typically pretty small, and so probably the average company that we invest in is 2 to 4 founders, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
And
So
every once in a while
early
they'll be
too, right? I mean, that's another
very early
measure of that.
Yeah. So probably half of the companies we invest in don't even have any kind of product yet. They might have some like duct tape, what we call proof of concept prototype. But there's no real engineering that's been done. There's no real product market fit or any kind of sales or anything. So we're very, very, very early in that regard. We've invested in a bunch of companies that don't even have an idea. They're just an interesting person and they want to build something and they know it's going to be roughly like this. But they have
I
no
have a
idea
really hard time with that, actually. I mean, I know that happens,
Yeah.
but so you're saying that person, though, out of 120 people that have also approached you with maybe more, how do you pick that person?
It's a bunch of things, and it's one of the probably again, at least for me, one of the most challenging parts of my sort of day-to-day job. There are people out there which have it's kind of like this gravity thing I talk about a lot with the sort of team analogy, that just have this way of talking and experience that really aligns with a problem area that they're super passionate about. And so there are take someone like Mike Phillips, who's the founder of a company called Sense, one of our very early Fund 1 investments, who is the exact right guy to be building sort of roughly the thing he was talking about. Wasn't really sure exactly what it would be at the time, but it was a thing that he knew sort of big data is probably a ridiculous term these days, but at the time was a big deal, and processing gigabytes of data a day on a device is a really hard thing to do really well, and he had a deep experience in speech, which is a very similar problem to
we've actually had Joe Bamberg on from Sense
of course,
as well.
Awesome.
And so he actually talked about Mike as so that's actually that's a great example, because you're saying because Mike had because he had that speech experience, he's like, I want to take this to this new area.
Exactly.
I think it's relevant enough. Then you're like, yeah, that's great. Okay.
Yeah, and my first partner, Axel, had worked with Mike on his first company called Speechworks, which is interestingly enough how SolidWorks got its name, which I think is very funny for those mechanical engineers out there. They sort of copied that, and loved Mike and thought Mike was one of the sharper CEOs in Boston, and decided he no matter what he wants to work on, basically he wants to work with Mike. And so as soon as Mike started talking about working on a physical product, he didn't exactly know exactly what it would be and exactly how he would sell it. But he was like, I really think load desegregation should be an easier thing to do. And it's an extremely hard problem. We decided to invest, and it's taken a couple of interesting turns along the way, but I think they're doing great and have hired some wonderful engineers. And the product is, it's a really hard problem, but I think it works reasonably well. But so that's just an example of like a great founder working on something that their background has a good, like sort of what we call founder market fit. So they're clearly the type of person to kind of work roughly in this area. And, our business is powered by taking a flyer sometimes on really good people.
So intuition, that kind of thing around.
Of course,
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So that's not always the case, but that is sometimes the case. So then the people that are 2 to 4 person teams, what are they going to experience when they come in and talk to Bolt folks?
Yeah. So as part of the sort of like investment process, we'll spend a lot of time trying to get to know them and their business and however much they have in sort of market and customer traction, et cetera. We might do a couple of diligence calls and try to understand, many of the times where we don't know the rocket launch market. So we got to go talk to a couple of those companies and kind of learn about it. And after, typically, a couple of weeks, we kind of get a handle on that and either decide to invest or not. If we decide to invest, probably about 70% of those companies will move into one of our offices. So not everybody, it's not requirement. We don't run like an accelerator program where show up on this day. But it's a sort of a perk that we offer to companies, mainly because we found that collaboration of physical product development works better when it's in person versus remotely. And so that's sort of the reason for the office space thing. We have a big shop, and a lot of the companies like to use that for 3D printers and laser cutters and welding and CNC machines and all that stuff. And so we try to push companies to sort of use those common resources so they don't have to spend money to have other people do it.
Makes sense. Right.
Yeah.
And then you also have people on hand to help with that stuff, though, as well.
That's right. Yeah, which is by far the most valuable part of sort of that investment process. process. And so the Tyler, who runs our engineering team, very early guy on the Apple iPhone team, as a PM at Apple for many years, building many of those products, has just sort of seen, both the good and the bad and probably the ugly too, of product development, and sort of manages us interfacing with the company on the engineering side. And so underneath him sit a whole bunch of super talented individual contributor engineers that, again, sort of cover the sort of mechanical aspects of a product, all the electrical stuff, both on the board side and the firmware side. We do a bunch of again, not like perfect IDEO, whatever frog design ID, but we spend a lot of time thinking about, ID in a good enough way.
How is the person holding this thing, at least, versus
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and like just sort of pushing folks to think through interaction a little bit. I don't think any of our products are going to win awards, Red Dot Awards or whatever, for like amazing ID out of the gate, and that's intentional, because doing that takes a lot and money and adds risks.
What if we put in like the most curves into our perfectly milled injection molds? Yeah.
Well, it's so funny. I mean, I could go on forever about like product design firms. I used to run one, and so I know how that business works really well. But it's really unfortunate, the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed company that like comes through that process after having spent whatever $500,000 on some product development process and gets this thing that looks awesome, and if you try to make it, you're totally fucked. And or you're going to spend whatever 3 times more on tooling and on crazy shit that you have to do in order to make
so we have a 1 millimeter wide plastic wall.
Exactly.
It really helps the design.
Yeah, it's critical for this very first product we're going to make,
and it's going to be dropped every day.
Exactly. Yeah, and frozen and all kinds of crazy shit. So we try really hard to kind of get the companies to think about ID early on in that kind of way. And so we have a full-time industrial designer. We have 2 folks that help with prototyping. And so sort of running the shop and sort of helping people think about, okay, how do I test this, or how do I build a fixture to assemble this more effectively? Teaching them how to use machines and 3D printers and everything. It's really a sort of teach a person to fish rather than, giving him the fish or whatever the opposite of that is. And so it's really trying to get them to sort of think proactively about how to build some of these products. And then we spend a bunch of time helping them through the manufacturing process, which in most cases is not the tier 1 gigantic Chinese contract manufacturer. In many cases, it's the local box build house and
the Tempos of the world, I'm sure, right? Yeah.
Totally, yeah. And they're in the shop sometimes, like with the people that own the factory, quote unquote factory, bringing up boards and running tests and looking at test data and stuff. And that is how, as a company, you master production, is not by, sending it off to some fancy company and having them do everything, but it's by you sitting there and learning, okay, I'm going to design the fixture that makes this process more efficient. And I'm going to give it to the CM so they know how to use it. And then you iterate on that. And that process, at least in my experience, is how you build wonderful supply chains. And it's not by, hiring these big fancy companies that have, no worries, we'll do it for you. There's no easy button, as my partner Scott Miller likes to say. Yeah.
Right. Well, Scott's been on the shows before as well.
Yeah.
So
cool. Yeah. I mean, he has definitely a wonderful experience on the sort of, bigger production runs of mostly consumer electronics, and probably is responsible for building one of the most complicated consumer electronic devices ever, Roomba. Yeah. And it's really, it's a marvel. I can't talk too much about it, but walking through the primary Roomba factory is really amazing.
That stuff. I mean, like, especially because it was, not really done before at a consumer level.
Yeah. And it's crazy because when they first did it, and it was 2000 or 2001, their cost targets were way lower than they are now. And I think the first Roomba was $199, if I remember correctly.
Oh, wow.
And so they didn't have, cost of goods to spend money on, a TI processor or some fancy,
right, that's building a
sensor.
Toy at that point, right? I mean, there's toys. Exactly. There are toys that are $199
that cost that much. Yeah, totally. Yeah, they have whatever $45-$50 a BOM cost to build a robot with a bunch of motors and sensing and software. It's crazy. And that first Roomba, and I'm sure Scott's talked about this in some way, shape, or form publicly. They built things from on PIC controllers, these crazy from scratch sensors so they could save 3 cents because there were 8 of them or whatever, and just having to like cost optimize everything. And it's so funny because now they sell these like $800 Roombas, and they just like buy a bunch of stuff off the shelf, which is really funny to me, because they realized they were artificially low on the price, and that's again something they would have figured out if they started to sell this thing differently. They would probably learn that slightly easier than they did.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing though too is that the Dysons of the world push that market up too, right?
Totally.
So there's like market forces end up impacting entire companies like that.
Of course, but again, I think they spent a huge amount of money and energy, manufacturing this product with these constraints they didn't actually know they had, or they thought they had, but they didn't. Yeah. And my suspicion is they could have spent, $60 or $70 or even $100 on bill of materials and probably been okay. But they thought they had this. Again, I don't remember the exact price, but I think it was $199. Really aggressive price target. Right. Whereas when you compare it to like even like a decent vacuum, that vacuums are expensive. Yeah. Even I remember even 10 years ago, you'd easily find a $500 vacuum that was middle of the market. And now I think it's hard to find a vacuum that's that's less than a couple $100. Mainly due to Dyson.
You and I might be shopping different places, Ben, but I have found a low cost
you really
vacuum.
Are.
Yeah. Over here in the Midwest, my friend, we got some cost constraints going on.
I actually, kidding aside, I actually did buy my first vacuum Dyson cleaner not too long. Dyson vacuum cleaner. Yeah. There we go. Words. For the first time. It is really impressive. Yeah. It is extremely well designed, and it's one of those companies that I've kind of like, I kind of know of Dyson and the whole thing, but I was actually sort of surprised that I hadn't bought one earlier. I'm a pretty cheap guy, and I never thought spending $600 on a vacuum made any sense. But which is also why I don't own a Roomba. But it is impressive. It is clearly a far superior design of a product than anything else I've ever owned.
Well, I would point you to the vacuum guy on Reddit. He did not like this. I'll point you to that. Okay. But I also will point Please you do. To the. I was going to actually bring this up earlier. There's a great NPR show called How I Built This. And
I know it. Yeah, it's great. It's wonderful.
Big fan of that show. And I really like that they always ask, because the reason it came up before is because you were always saying we were super lucky, and it's like the question that Guy Raz always asked is like, are you good or you're lucky? And I think that
sure. Yeah.
I don't think they ever give enough credence to lucky, but I also don't think they don't want to talk down their their hard work. And it's like, but damn, some people are lucky. Just time wise, it's like,
totally.
And hard work makes luck. But
this is a thing that I think it was actually Brad Feld who first told me this. And again, this comes, you have to sort of put it in context. This is a guy who's made many, many, many millions of dollars working with some of the most famous companies out there, and is just a sort of luminary sort of figure in the venture world. And he said something to me at some point, I'm pretty sure it was him. It was to the effect of like, if I had the choice between being good at stuff and being lucky at stuff, I take lucky every single time. Yeah. Right. And there are some people that are just really good at like attracting luck, and that is incredibly powerful leverage.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're probably doing other things in there too, of course, right? It's not like they're just resting on their laurels, But I'll sign me up for luck too. I'll take that one.
For sure, yeah. I'll have a double serving
yes, please.
Of luck. So I think to answer your question earlier about sort of the Bolt sort of engineering stuff, so a bunch of these humans that we have that work full-time for us, and then we run companies through a fairly rigorous process going through sort of the early product development we call proof of concept, prototype development, which most companies have done by the time we've seen them, and then through the sort of design process, so thinking through user interaction and industrial design, and typically software sort of paradigms and how companies are sort of interfacing with a product and icons and all that stuff, and also the sort of engineering process of thinking through writing specs and sort of detailed engineering design component qualification and somewhat rigorous testing around making sure the product is going to survive and can be dropped.
No returns, and all that
please.
Stuff. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, you want to minimize that. Yeah. That's the thing that people very often forget in the hardware world is you're not done when you sell the product. Right. And then merging those two really usually separate prototypes, so that sort of first process creates what's called a looks-like prototype, and the second part of that process, the engineering part, creates a works-like prototypes, or sometimes a bunch of works-like prototypes. Then you have this really hard part of the process where you're trying to cram everything into one, and we call that an EP, or an engineering prototype, and that is the sort of fusion of this beautiful model, looks-like model, and this functional. It could be 1 or it could be 5 or 10 functional prototypes that all sort of do different things. And that is by far the hardest part of the process, to go from these two sort of idealistic models into one that is a functional product. And that process takes a while, many months. And then we go through the sort of early production process. Pretty much all companies do their early production runs internally. So they do them at our office. So, sometimes it's, 5 and 10 units at a time. And sometimes we have companies that build 100 units a
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they've
actually getting them out in the field and shipping them out.
Yeah. And they have a little line. They learn how to do inventory and, all the little things that kind of go into making a great sort of really supply chain. And companies definitely figure out a bunch of stuff by having their own facility and their own time and their own people that they're managing kind of work with, through that process themselves. And typically during that process, we're also doing all of the sort of traditional venture things. So, helping them put their pitch deck together and work on business model and talk to investors and raise money and hire and board meetings and all that stuff. But I tend to focus when I'm talking about the engineering stuff, because I think that's really what differentiates us from other VCs.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about that too, though, because you had said earlier that it's like anywhere from 100K up to 1 million. And, nothing against San Francisco, but that's like 3 or 4 months of employees. I mean,
it's crazy. It depends on how big you are.
I mean,
but yeah.
So, and not to mention also to talk about the thing that most VCs don't talk about or understand, or like, it's like you also have to buy parts and you have to buy molds and you have to like all the other things you have to kind of squeeze in there. And it's not just office chairs and laptops. It's also other stuff. So how far are they expected to go on that first check that you write?
It's a big range. Okay. And there are some companies that are able to, again, a lot of this depends on complexity of product.
Yeah, sure.
And complexity of, when I say product, I mean like business product, the entire thing.
Right.
Yeah. And so if you have a piece of software and a website and a backend and a data service and AI and a piece of hardware and, all this stuff, that tends to take more money and more time and more people than if you're, we have some companies that are 2 people, they've been 2 people for 9 months and they're, doing $1 million in revenue a year.
That ain't bad.
That's a great business in a bunch of ways. They hope to grow it, but, and they'll need to hire people to do that, but they still have that framework, which is really great.
So you're trying to get them on that first check to the engineering prototype at least?
We try really hard to get them there, and it's not always possible. But that there is a huge mind shift when you have a single product, single model or prototype that an investor can see that both functions and looks good. There's this step function value change in the company because people can kind of interact with that product. And again, that's not just a prototype. That's not just a physical part. It's also the website or whatever skeleton they use to interact with it, or the data or the consumable or whatever. And, to be honest, this probably only happens in, 60, 70% of the cases. But that's our big goal, is to get companies to that point. And then that is a sort of key enabler for them to go talk to other investors to raise money, typically at a better price. So they have less dilution because they have, sign that this is a product that people respond to. Almost always that EP or sometimes the sort of next step, the EVT, comes with some sort of beta testing consumer B2B feedback.
Okay.
And so it's not just to build a prototype.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You're not making one. You're making at least 10.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You're never making just 1 or 2 units. You're trying to get a handle on, I built this thing and I made all these assumptions during the development process. Are these assumptions true? And you do that by, as an example, like Juicero, the product they shipped, I would describe that as an EP or an EVT. It is a very early stage product, which should not have been sold by the hundreds or thousands to end users. It should have been, by the 10 or 20s to friends of the company and other people that know it's a beta, to see if the pricing makes sense, to see if the product makes sense and people can pay for it, et cetera. And so we try really hard to get our companies to kind of get to that place prior to, building tools and hiring Foxconn and spending millions of dollars and having 50 people on the staff, et cetera. It's not always possible with certain products and certain markets, but that's our big goal.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, like it sounds like Bolt at least has a very realistic grasp on the world. It's not just like, if we just throw more resources at it, it'll just work, it's like, it's all about heart.
Yeah.
Like that,
Totally.
that usually gets me kind of down when I start hearing that stuff.
Totally.
And
and I think there are definitely companies and VCs that have that sort of attitude. We're like super against companies raising too much money. I actually think it's worse to raise too much money than not enough money.
I learned that from Silicon Valley. Monica told them that, and it was the good advice. Yeah,
totally. I mean, Silicon Valley is one of these amazing shows that like manages to both be a farce and also have like a pretty serious line of truth in it, which I think is why it's so painful to watch for VCs and other folks in the startup community, because you kind of resonate. Like, yeah, it's a farce and it takes it too far, but it comes from truth.
Right. They're amplifying at least some nugget, right?
Totally, and that's why it hurts, because you read whatever big head sitting on their roof, getting paid more money than most people in most countries. Exactly. And this is true. There are people like that.
Man.
So I think it's very, Mike Judge and the writing team is super skillful at sort of taking the farce to just the right level to make it ridiculous, but also still feel true. Yeah. And so we really cautioned against the like giant $100 million financings prior to shipping anything.
Yeah,
I think that's incredibly dangerous, which is not common. Many of my VC friends would disagree with me, have disagreed with me, and have gotten in fights about it. And it's hard to fight against when you are talking to a founder and they're like, "Listen, I can raise twice as much money for the same dilution." Oh, that is a hard conversation to have with someone.
Could you? Well, I guess people can look up dilution. I was going to say, but you're just saying that
Sure.
it sounds like a better deal to them, right? It
Exactly.
just means just run a little bit faster, but it's like, whoa, buddy. Yeah.
It's like if like I could buy, a really good, $40,000 BMW, or there's this one dealer I can go to and they're going to give me an $80,000 Tesla for $40,000. Like, I'm going to take the Tesla every time.
Right. But the Tesla has no seatbelts.
It might kill you. Yeah, right. Totally. Yeah. Right. So, or whatever the analogy is here. I don't know how far that analogy will run, but, the idea is the same. And you wind up getting just a quote unquote better deal, as you said.
The lithium batteries inside there, we didn't test those.
You'll be fine. You'll be fine.
I actually had a lithium battery blow up behind me the other day.
Ooh,
holy crap.
They're big fires. Yeah. It's scary as shit.
I ran and I had adrenaline pumping for like 2 hours. It was scary as hell.
I've only seen it once in person. I've seen a bunch of videos, but I've only seen it once in person. And it was one of the few times I was really scared. When you see like the jet, because the pressure is so immense that you see these jets come out. And especially because at least the one I saw was a puncture, which is I think how most people get in trouble with lithium batteries is they put a drill bit through it or some piece of metal or something, and they get a little small hole. And chain reactions are really fucking dangerous. So please be careful.
Well, and I'm sure that, that's another thing that your engineers probably, this was a one-off thing that I saw, but there's companies that are like, oh yeah, so we're going to go and just ship a product with, lots of lithium ion batteries. But, at least you have engineers that are like, do UL testing, make sure you do drop testing. Like we had Steve on here a couple weeks ago talking about understanding the actual constraints of batteries and that kind of thing. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. That's the way we talk to our sort of, value proposition, if you think about it that way, to companies is, yes, you can go out and hire, a full-time engineer in the Bay Area, pay them, $150,000 a year or whatever. And they might have worked on one or two products, and that's great. And sometimes they haven't; they're new, and that's okay too. But when you sort of arm your team with a bunch of folks that have shipped, in many cases, millions of units of product for well-known companies and have been through this process sometimes 20, 30, 40 times, even with a junior engineer, it gives them this incredible leverage to not make some of these decisions that sometimes first-time engineers will make. And we're all victims of that. I used to be that guy too. And so it's really this sort of safety net for the companies to kind of help them run through a little bit more rigorous of a process and think a little bit less about the perfect component and the amazing layout on the board, and a little bit more about, is this battery life make sense for the end user, or does, your cost structure going to, line up with the way this product needs to be sold, or have you done appropriate testing? Are you dealing with a pre-certified module so you don't have to spend a bunch of money on CDMA certifications and PCBRB and all that stuff? Right. And little things like that. It sounds silly, but those really add up. There's a bunch of them.
I think the frustrating thing for me is that it's when a lot of these investment models that are were created for software and were very successful for software as well. And then it's like, and then it's like, okay, now we're gonna do the same thing for hardware, right? And it's, that's not saying it's with you, but like just companies in general. It's like, now let's apply that same thing. And then those same criteria, like you talked about before, of like looking for a certain type of founder, and like that idea of a VC being like, well, we want someone who's brash and new and has done these things. And it feels like in software that works because frameworks change all the time, right? And it's possible to get someone who's a young upstart and trying something new and doing something with the technology that everyone's new at, and that's great. But with hardware, it's like, damn, man, this stuff's been out there. Like it's, totally. there are new processes, but the old stuff matters just as much in hardware. It's like we're dragging all this baggage with us in the hardware world. Yeah. And to say that like it's just a young upstart with just can-do it attitude is going to get you through, it's like, oh man, that's going to go poorly.
Yeah.
I mean,
good luck.
I'm sure we'll work in certain cases, and then that'll be used as the example. But like, I think more often than not, it will not be used. I feel like this is like my old crotchety man statement here, but
totally, I'm 100% with you. Yeah, I mean, I the way I definitely say it a little bit differently, but I think there's a lot of overlap in our two philosophies. I think the way I always talk about it is there actually has been a ton of change in the sort of quote unquote hardware ecosystem. And when I first started doing this, like if you wanted a Bluetooth radio, you were going to like CSR and you were like writing glue code to like connect.
Right. All the radios pieces were different chips as well. You're tying those together.
Yeah.
Right.
You had 5 different pieces. Yeah, exactly. And there was so much heavy lifting that you had to do in order to like get a product, just like to commute, to like just send one byte to a phone. Yep. And now you go like buy a pre-certified module. It's like preloaded with firmware. It's got a little, M0 processor on there, and you're up and running in a day or two. That has really changed. I think what hasn't changed is all the stuff behind development.
Right.
And so sort of after the sort of product is designed, the slowest pieces to change are the sort of infrastructure, the supply chain management, the tooling, the inventory management, all that stuff. Those are these big, heavy, slow things, which aren't necessarily bad. You just have to know how to operate within those constraints. And unfortunately, most bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, first-year engineers, they took their mechanical engineering class on how a injection mold press works, and they understand it theoretically, but they've never like bought a tool before. Sure. They've never like gone to China and like negotiated with a line manager with some, step that's being done incorrectly and trying to convince them that they need to do it in a different way. Yeah. And these little pieces of wisdom are so much more important on that sort of back half of the sort of product curve than I can build the perfect product right away. And it doesn't take much. It takes, talking to a handful of folks that have been around the block and have watched this process happen a few times and have pattern matched, okay, these kinds of things tend to work well, and these kinds of things tend to, stay away from these. You wind up with, at least in my experience, like pretty good,
better shot,
pretty good process. Yeah, better shot. Yeah, you're not going to, it's not a surefire success, but you're less likely to have something small and tactical trip you up, which unfortunately is how many, Kickstarter and sort of Indiegogo projects get derailed. Is not because there's a bad idea, or it's because someone trying to steal money or whatever. It's because they haven't been through it before, and so they didn't know what they didn't know, and that causes a huge problems, whether it's timelines or quality or, bad suppliers or whatever. But if you just, this is how Scott has a business, right? With Dragon, sure. Like if you just talk to someone who's been there a couple of times, they're not going to make it perfect. Like, not every company that works with Dragon is wildly successful, but they will